anybody likes stickers, you can take that, you go with on your bottles or whatever. Our Kingdom Restoration Lab is right down here as well. It's trying to promote collaboration. Okay. All right, well, we're going to start right at 9:30. We'll pray, all right? We need to do a mic check. The mics are on? Is it on? Check, check, check. Is it good? I don't. Check, check. The camera is going to be pointed at you, and so you can look at them, but the camera will be zoomed out. You can look anywhere you want. Got to speak loudly. Okay, all right. If you look backwards, we might stop it.
Test.
Okay. All right, so we want to open this time in prayer. Hey, we're all here
Test.
because we care about our city, and we know that the flourishing of our city will come when our families flourish. And we know that no person or organization, no church can do this alone. And we have got to come together at this time, uniting our voices and our hearts for the work of the kingdom. And we can't do it without you. Your presence here is invaluable. I thank you for it. And moving forward, we've got to lock arms now more than ever. And I hope that this inspires and challenges you. And I really hope that you will think of a good question. Jenny is going to facilitate the questions here. Lindsay is going to text me the questions from online. And then we'll go from there. Okay? So we're going to open this time in prayer before we start, and we got 2 minutes before we start. So,
As I tell my kids, Mitchell, take a deep yoga breath.
Yoga.
Take a deep yoga breath.
Right. Hey, Teresa, Michaela, will you open this time in prayer? Just before we get rolling. That casualties from the COVID-19 health crisis are cascading indiscriminately across sectors of our society, and they are disproportionately affecting children and families in our city. Families are more than just the core of San Antonio. Families are also the key thread in the fabric of God's design for creation. We also understand that family and the restoration of family is core to the restoration plan of God, who in Genesis 12 called Abraham to himself. And he said that he would bless Abraham's family. And through that family, he would bless all the families of the earth. And so the priority for us as we gather is to have a collective listening session strategically listening so that we can discover how we can participate in God's work of redemptive restoration for children and our families in this city. We're going to hear from 6 different sectors in our city, 9 different leaders speaking about children and family. This forum has been called by the Redeeming the Crisis Task Force, and it has been put together with Decade of Family. And our desire is that through this, the church will have a deep and collective impact, moving from insulation and isolation, oftentimes apathy, to empowerment and engagement on behalf of our city. This forum will inform you, and it will challenge you, and it will be a catalyst for engagement and empowerment. We have over 28 different churches and organizations that are represented here in this room, all social distance, all have the air purifier back here. We all have masks on. We want to be safe. But we also have 9 panelists. I can't tell you how excited I am that we get to hear from you all. Thank you for being here. This forum is also being recorded, and we hope that you will share your voice on the video outside before you leave if you haven't yet. And we're going to share this forum with 100 different churches in our city so that 2021 can be a time of authentic, collaborative, and collective impact for children and families in our city. I am honored to have Jenny Lord here with me. She is the CEO of Chosen. It's a nationally recognized organization that cares for children and families in the foster care space. Jenny has an unparalleled heart for families, and she's a very, very valuable partner in mission in this city, our mission city. I want to ask you first, Jenny, as we get started, why is the flourishing of families essential for the flourishing of San Antonio?
I believe that families, and God believes, knowing His Word, God knows that families are the backbone to our community, right? And truly, we can't have a flourishing city without flourishing families. I was speaking with somebody recently in the Economic Development Foundation and talking about we can't attract businesses to this city if families are not strong. Families that are strong build a strong economy. Families that are strong make a huge impact on our city. You can look around at the moral decay that we see everywhere and trace almost every bit of that back to the disintegration of families. So I believe, as Mitchell said, this is a time for the church to shine, a time for the church to be called back to discipling families so that we can strengthen families in our city. Today I have Jennifer Smith here with us from the South Texas Alliance for Orphans, and I'd like to ask you, Jennifer, how have the unseen children and families in our city been impacted through this crisis?
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you, Mitchell, for this time. I want to share this with you guys. Emergency placement for a sibling group of 5, ages 2 newborns, a 4-year-old, a 9-year-old, and a 10-year-old. Emergency placement for a 16-year-old. Emergency placement for a 4-day-old. Another emergency placement needed for twin 2-year-olds. An emergency placement needed for a 14-year-old. Another one for a 17-year-old. Yet another emergency placement needed for a newborn and another newborn. Emergency placement needed for a sibling group of 2, ages 13 and 17. Emergency placement needed for a 16-year-old. Emergency placement needed for a sibling group of 4, ages 5, 11, 12, and 13. Another one needed for a 1-year-old. Another one needed for a 4-month-old. Another emergency placement needed for a 15-year-old. And yet another one for a 2-month-old. These are referrals that came down from Child Protective Services last week for Bexar County kids needing Bexar County homes. This is what has happened in our community due to Corona. It was already happening, and it has gotten even worse since Corona has hit. That's not the end. 185 youth aged 18 to 24 are homeless. That's up from 45% from last year. 152 unaccompanied youth ages 0 to 17. That's up 55% from last year. 26 parenting youth are homeless right now. That's up 73% from last year. My name is Jennifer Smith. I'm the executive director of the South Texas Alliance for Orphans. We serve and equip the church to fulfill their biblical call to care for children and families impacted by the foster care system. As our community has altered our entire way of living to flatten the curve in COVID, we have drastically increased the curve for all factors that lead to child abuse and neglect and family crisis. Domestic violence, mental health crisis, drug and alcohol abuse, financial instability, housing instability are all factors that lead to children being abused and neglected and needing foster homes in our community. Now, couple that with quarantine orders, which have slowed if not stopped everything that are the safety nets for these kids and these families. All agencies have had to stop or slow down recruiting foster families. All measures that support foster families have slowed. All treatment of children with trauma in various ways has been altered or slowed down. So all the factors that not only help create capacity for our kids, but help our kids heal have been dramatically impacted by Corona. The great news, though, is this room and this panel is full of amazing, passionate people who will find a way to serve children and families despite whatever is happening in this community. And that's the encouraging part that you need to hear. Agencies have pivoted their trainings online. Foster families are doing support groups via Zoom, meeting in parking lots to give each other support. Amazing things are happening despite all of the crazy that's happening right now. You see, we serve a God of proximity. He sees hard places and broken people and goes towards them, not away from them. And we will too. It's who we are. And so if you want to get closer to kids and hurting families, I would encourage you to connect with one of these great organizations up here or with us at the South Texas Alliance for Orphans, and we can help your church find a way to walk alongside one child and one family for the next year, and we will radically change a generation.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. As you note, on the one hand, we should acknowledge that there are families and children that are flourishing during this time. But the reality is that many are not, and most are not. And you mentioned mental health. At this time, I want to ask a question to Doug Beach, who's the board president for NAMI, the National Alliance for Mental Illness in San Antonio. I'm going to start with a quote, Doug. It comes from the medical field. Dr. Ed Parada, who's been an ER Methodist Children's Hospital doctor since 1997, he says this: about 10 years ago, we would see 1 or 2 children per month with either suicidal thoughts or attempts. Now, we are seeing several per day. Last week, we were holding 9 children in the ER awaiting placement into pediatric psychiatric facilities. There is a marked increase in the number of children struggling with these thoughts and acting on them. Doug, can you give us a window into mental health in children and families in our city?
Sure. Thank you, Mitch. The situation that Dr. Parada describes is both heartbreaking and alarming, but it's not limited to just children. In a normal year, 1 in 5 adults will experience a mental health disorder. So in a church with 500 members, that's 100 individuals that will experience a mental health disorder this year. So what's the impact on families and individuals when somebody in the family lives with a mental health diagnosis? Well, first, the negative impacts of serious mental illness are not limited to the person with the illness, but extend to all the other family members. Family members or relatives take almost all the responsibility of caring for the person living with the illness. Second, caring for a person with mental illness takes a substantial toll on the social relationships, employment, income, and psychological well-being of the family. Third, children of people living with a serious mental illness have a higher risk of developing physical and mental illnesses for a variety of reasons, including stigma, financial difficulties, the burden of caring for ill parents, and sometimes genetic vulnerability. Fourth, research shows that strong family systems reduce the impact, not the incidence, but the impact of mental illness on the whole family. So how has the pandemic affected our mental health. In a survey that Mental Health America has conducted over the past 9 months, January through September of this year, where they surveyed over 1.5 million people, these are some of the findings. The number of people looking for help with anxiety and depression has skyrocketed. Over 300,000 people who took this survey, and that was a 93% increase over 2019, when 500,000 people took the depression screen, and there was a 62% increase over 2019. Today, there are more people reporting frequent thoughts of suicide and self-harm than have ever been recorded by this Mental Health America screening program since it was launched in 2014. Since COVID-19 pandemic began to spread, there's been a 37% increase in people who have reported frequent suicidal ideation. In September, 2 months ago, 37% reported having thoughts of suicide more than half or nearly all day. Young people are struggling the most with their mental health. Rates of suicidal ideation are especially high among youth. People screening at risk for mental health conditions are struggling most with isolation and loneliness. And all this is occurring in a state, Texas, that is ranked as number 3 in the prevalence of mental illness in the country, and number 51, 50 states in the District of Columbia, in access to care. So if there was ever a need for faith communities to come together and to engage, it must be now. Thank you, Mitch.
Thank you, Doug. It's very sobering. We all know that this pandemic has had a profound impact on schools, children in schools. Today we have DeSelly here from the South Texas Children's Home, also known as Stitch. And DeSelly, if you could just talk a little bit about the impact of this pandemic on families and teachers.
Thank you, Jenny and Mitchell, for the invitation to share with you all today. I have to take deep breaths frequently because it's overwhelming. The statistics are just cascading. Our families, I've been in the mental health field for over 10 years. And this year has been really the first year that I've experienced just an outright assault on the families. They've experienced financial hardships. They have had to forego family gatherings. The parents have had to teach their kids at home. Just an overwhelming assault, again, on families. And so I think if there is any positive, and I use that word lightly, out of this place that we're in right now, it's that we are now having conversations about mental health. Where before we weren't having them as often. It's coming to the light. And now, more than ever, we're having the conversations too where people are describing their feelings about depression and anxiety, and the person that you're talking to knows exactly what you're talking about because they're experiencing the same thing. So we're not alone in the place that we are, and I think that the way that we can tackle this together, and if we're going to help people find any kind of meaning in their circumstances, it's going to be to acknowledge the fact that what we are doing right now is hard. And we are all struggling. No one has gone untouched by this pandemic. We are all struggling. And the second part of that is that when we connect with people, we must commit to listening without judgment. Because that's going to deepen the connection, and it's going to deepen the relationship that we inherently come with. We are a people of community. We were not created to live life alone and in isolation. And so it's sobering to see this many people in this room and more virtually that have the same heart for helping people. And so together collectively, we begin to create and deepen relationships with other people then we can get beyond this and we can begin to build resilience, which is a key factor in mental health. So I'm very grateful for this time to be with
Well,
you.
we're grateful for your partnership and collaboration, Gisele. And as we focus more on education, we talk about the brain and mental health. It is an organ like every other organ. But you have to have a huge heart to be serving in education. And Pam Ray, who is a principal at Idea Ewing Hallsville Public School, we would love to hear your heart and what you are seeing for children and families through education.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to be here and share my very humble experiences and that of my colleagues in education. I'd like to start with some of the bright spots that really touch my heart when I reflect. Families are showing up, and what that looks like is extended families, grandparents, TIAs, TOs, everyone's like showing up, running errands, coming to the school to pick up laptops, and some of them are really just doing the very best that they can to rally and support their families. There's also been an increase in family time for some families because people are being home and there's not as many pull factors for people to be leaving and finding excuses not to be with family. And I think they've rediscovered some really meaningful relationships, and some adults have stepped into lives that they've not been in a while. And I think I just want to add one more quick bright spot is like parents are learning more about what the childs are learning at school, and I think there's a deepened respect for what's happening at school, and parents are really trying to understand that more and trying to be more involved. And I think after this, that's going to go on and carry a lot of momentum for the family and for children. I would like to speak to some of the things that I'm still discovering, and I think outside of the COVID initial impact of people jockeying to try to make sure they had the resources they needed for their families, most importantly, food and shelter. And so we had to, as a school, step back and really understand that that is the most important thing that families are trying to rally around and make sure that their families have. And at that first instinct, the schooling wasn't the biggest priority. And I'll just share with you personally, I had to step back and realize that that was the right thing. Academic gaps are growing, and that's really obvious, but it really is big, and it's really happening. And we can't afford to continue to do that. And particularly with our students with disabilities and our English learners, we're seeing that as they're not accessing school as much, or maybe going back to Mexico or their native countries in this time to serve their extended families, they might not be accessing their education or other English speakers. And so if that's the way they're accessing their learning, that could potentially be a gap in something we're learning. I think most important to me, we're feeling that children in a lot of cases are feeling invisible, and that's emotionally and physically. And that's hard to say because it's, in some cases, they may not be feeling like they're seen or heard. Lack of in-person contact, lack of connections. We all know those connections are really important. And in some cases, we really are watching deeply for the adequate supervision, that they have that at home as they're accessing their learning. And I think connected to that are those secure attachments for adults, parents, grandparents. If they don't have access to those people outside of their families, I believe that those adult figures in children's lives, in parents' lives, those secure attachments might be very limited. And I'll round up by just saying that people feel overwhelmed. Children feel overwhelmed, parents feel overwhelmed, grandparents feel overwhelmed because they're trying, but they don't have the skills they need to access the technology that's needed, the resources, organization, managing everything that's at home. And I'd like to also add in there, and I'm glad you brought that up, Arisel, about the staff. I think teachers are really carrying a big burden also of their families and balancing the big hearts they have to still change the world for the children. And so I'm just really thankful that there's such a community of people in San Antonio that are really stepping up to recognize that we can all work together and we need to respond.
Thank you.
Pam, thank you. I think I echo everyone's collective voice here and just recognizing that the schools and the educators You have one of the toughest jobs in this pandemic of anybody. The work that you're doing for our kids, like we see the extra jobs that you're having to do, and we just applaud you and thank you. I also want to introduce Officer Doug Green from our SAPD force, and he is going to talk to us today with a new beard about security and families during this time.
Thank you, Jenny, and thank you, First Pres, for giving us this opportunity again to speak on this important topic. I also want to thank all the veterans that are amongst us and are watching right now. Thank you so much for your service. The devil has his crosshairs on the family. He knows if he can hit that, he can do a lot of damage. And as was mentioned, you can tie the crime in our community to destruction and hurt in the family. Whether it be a shooting, whether it be a robbery, whether it be a theft, if you get to know the person who committed that crime, everybody's going to have something in common about some kind of trauma that they've experienced in their family. But I'm so glad that someone said, in this world you will have tribulations, but take heart, be of good cheer, take comfort. I have overcome the world. We are doing some good work here in San Antonio. There's a lot of work to be done, and the workers are few. And so that's why I'm so glad that we're doing this, because we need to gain more workers to come in and help us in this battleground to help our families here in San Antonio. One thing that I'm very proud of, and as I look back on it and I see God working, is the San Antonio Police Department's Handle with Care program. We started this program with the schools. The schools have such a vital responsibility, and they are true heroes in our community. And that is where a lot of our outcries come from, is from those teachers and those counselors who connect with those kiddos. So with the Handle with Care program, we have police officers that are out there, and when they respond to that family violence and they see those little kids there, they will send a notification to the school. So the school counselors can jump on that trauma immediately and break that cycle. And so yes, we do have a lot of work. Jennifer, as you said, with your report, we get a night CID report. Night CID are our night detectives that I have to look at every day. Every single day here in San Antonio, family violence, child abuse, every day. So the work is plenty, the workers are few, but again, take heart, be of good comfort. We don't mess around here in San Antonio.
That's right.
We love family, and we're gonna go to work, and I'm so excited to learn from all the panelists, and I'm so excited what the results are gonna be from today's gathering.
Thank you, Officer Green. We turn our attention to another officer, Jeremy Spencer, who is the family violence instructor for the SAPD Training Academy. And just a quick note, when Jeremy and Doug showed up in their ties and suits, it just added to my intimidation. You guys are looking sharp, and we're grateful for you. So Jeremy, could you give us a perspective on domestic violence in the casualties that are cascading from the COVID-19 health crisis?
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be with you all this morning. My name is Jeremy Spencer. I'm a police officer with SAPD, as the good pastor mentioned. I've been in law enforcement for 12 years. I now work as the family violence instructor for SAPD. My position involves training cadets as well as current officers. I help develop training curriculum, study national and local trends. I work with investigators, prosecutors, advocates, victims. We work to develop and refine training and to inform department policy. Before I discuss what SAPD intends for the state of the family, I'd like to define family and domestic violence and briefly provide some context. Family violence is willful behavior. It's part of a systematic pattern. It involves power and control, and it's marked by physical violence, sexual violence, psychological and emotional abuse. Statistics are not easy they're inadequate to measure the prevalence and severity of family violence. That's for many reasons, but based on the measurables that we can analyze, San Antonio and Bexar County, I'm sorry to say, has the highest and most lethal incidence of family violence per capita in the state. In working to combat this issue, SAPD cadets far exceed Texas minimum training requirements. They devote more than 28 hours to the study of family violence, human trafficking, and missing and exploited children. The cadet training curriculum takes a victim-centered, trauma-informed approach designed to educate them on the dynamics of family violence and how to appropriately intervene. In addition, current officers return to the training academy every year for additional training, continuing training, and they attend trainings well beyond what the state requires, and this often will include advanced investigative techniques relating to family violence. My goal with each new officer joining SAPD, and I admit freely and openly that much of this comes from my own personal experiences as a foster to adopt parent, along with my wonderful wife. We're blessed and so thankful to have been able to adopt 3 beautiful girls. That very much guides my approach, and my hope is that these cadets will recognize the opportunities laying just before them as they're preparing to hit the streets. I am consistently moved by their willingness to share how their own lives and their own paths were shaped by matters involving the family. For so many of our officers, they have a deeply seated desire to protect and serve the most vulnerable in our community. And my hope is that their approach to family violence will always not just be as a law enforcement officer, but as a victim's advocate, and that they will fight against family violence, not just with handcuffs and a badge and a gun, but also with knowledge and empathy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeremy. I know we're going to hear from Heather, but I just want to ask one quick follow-up question. Tragically, we lament the reality that we lead the state as a county in domestic violence. Have we seen reports of domestic violence or calls rise during this COVID-19 crisis?
The short answer is yes. The initial indicators, which of course it takes time to process the information coming in, but that there is a severe increase in family violence and intimate partner-related homicides.
Thank you for sharing that, and thank you both on behalf of the SAPD for all that you do for our city.
Yeah, thank you, Jeremy. I just want to echo what you said. You know, being known as having the highest incident of family violence and homicide in the state per capita, being known for that that's not a badge of honor that we want, right? And I know, and like Jennifer was talking about the removals in foster care, we have the highest removal rate of kids per capita in the state as well. These are not things that strengthen our economy or strengthen our community. So again, the church, this is an opportunity for the church to shine, to disciple families, to teach them how to deal with anger, how to process emotions, how to cope with stress and the stress during these times. I want to introduce Heather Pullen from CHRC, the Hope Center in our city, with multiple locations caring for really the most vulnerable in our city. Heather, can you share just a nonprofit perspective today about the families that you're seeing on the brink?
Thank you, Jenny. And thank you all for inviting us to be a part of this panel. So it's hard enough to handle the stress of these times, but the reality is half of families in San Antonio do not make a living wage. And more striking, San Antonio ranks #1 for the most impoverished city out of the top 25 metropolitan areas, according to the U.S. Census Bureau. With the shutdowns that occurred due to COVID, San Antonio families who are experiencing poverty were impacted even more drastically. Because many of our residents rely on the restaurant, hospitality, and tourism industries, we began to see families who were already struggling begin to struggle even more. During the shutdown, the SA Hope Center transitioned our services to distributing emergency food boxes. People were able to just drive through, and we would put a box of food in their car for whatever their needs were. Part of the requirements that the food bank had for us was that we would ask them a series of questions, And one of those questions was, what is your household income? And something that we frequently heard as a response was there'd be an eye roll, a dry laugh, and they would say, ugh, nothing now. And that led us to be able to ask more questions about their situations. But we talked to many people who were in tears. They'd never had to ask for food. They didn't know how to apply for benefits, and they were scared because they needed to provide for their families and didn't know what to do. Currently, even though businesses have begun to reopen, we still see a lot of families and children who are staying at home. Even children might not be able to return to school, or a lot of parents are still scared to send their children to school, so they are forced to stay home with them and instead of working. At the same time, we're also seeing children who were relying on the schools for their only meals of the day, now not receiving those meals at all. So how do we combat those issues? Last week, San Antonio voted yes to approve an $80 million workforce training and readiness program for those in our city who have lost jobs or need to secure better employment. In addition, the SA Hope Center continues to have major partnerships with First Presbyterian Church, where we have a satellite location in the Kingdom Restoration Lab. After 2 years of being down there, we now have 2 offices. We have 2 general case managers, a job readiness specialist, and as of last week, a housing specialist that was made possible through a major grant from the state with funds that come directly from COVID relief. We also have a major grant through the United Way and the City of San Antonio with an agency called Restore Education, where we are able to work with clients in order to obtain their GEDs or various workforce certifications. In addition to employment, we are providing a support system through our programs based on one-to-one relationships to make sure that individuals and families we serve have access to spiritual care, housing, financial literacy, parenting classes, health education, and many other services. Our community partnerships with First Pres and other community nonprofits are critical to making San Antonio a place where families can thrive.
Thank you very much. And partnership is essential now more than ever. And humility in partnership, in building trust, knocking down barriers that lead to turf wars is paramount for us to understand. The 2 largest entities in our city would easily be the government and the church. And no pressure, but I have the joy of welcoming Michelle Lugalia Holland, who is make sure I get this right, now the Director of Policy for the Mayor's Office. We thank you very much for taking time to be with us. And Pastor Bill Tucker, who is the Senior Pastor at Concordia Lutheran Church. And the same question as we conclude this panel time goes to both of you. And as they're answering, we want to encourage people that are present and those online to think about questions. The last part of our time together will be interactive, collaborative conversation. But to both of you all, with a heart of gratitude for your leadership, I ask, what is the role of the government and the church in caring for families that are afflicted by the casualties that are cascading into all of life from the COVID-19 health crisis? Michelle, you want to go first?
Thank you for having me. When I was thinking about that question, I think the one thing that we've been asking ourselves at the mayor's office is, what has the pandemic taught us about the necessary work ahead of us? We all saw the viral picture of hundreds of thousands of families lining up at the food bank. Many of our fellow residents who lead social service agencies can likely attest to the strains their families and their organizations are experiencing due to the impact of the pandemic, and we've heard a lot about what that looks like from different facets today. As a parent, being abruptly thrown into the juggle of keeping up with the demands of working remotely, while supporting my children with their schooling and ensuring that they are fed and spiritually sustained, has been an incredible challenge, and we've heard you talk about that today as well. And I am one of the lucky ones that has the privilege of having the necessary resources to manage it all. But what about those families without the necessary resources? Our entire community has been touched by the pandemic. which in San Antonio has triggered record unemployment, permanent and temporary business closures, and unprecedented school closings. The toll on our families, specifically our most vulnerable families, has been tremendous. In many ways, the pandemic has exposed troublesome fault lines and vulnerabilities in our community's foundation, which, truth be told, we know have been an unfortunate part of the San Antonio story for a long time. When it comes to our families, these root issues, low-wage jobs, low educational attainment, limited access to health care and coverage have led to poverty, economic segregation, and racial inequities, and have jeopardized their ability to thrive through adversity. So where has that left our families? Too many families in San Antonio have been and are living on the margins, without secure access to basic human needs: food, water, electricity, internet, and shelter. And to give you a sense of the scale of that, when the city of San Antonio set up the Emergency Housing Assistance Program that supports families to be able to afford and pay their rent during the pandemic, despite of the fact that they've lost their jobs, and to also support them through utilities, the burn rate for that fund was $2 million a week. Wow. $2 million a week. That's how quickly families fell into the valley. The pandemic's impact in our community has definitely made things worse, but it is very clear now that we need to figure out how to show up for our families to support their recovery, not just now in response to this crisis, but our solutions have to address where we struggled in the past and have in mind the reality we want our families to thrive in beyond the pandemic. This is how we wrap our arms around our families. The reality is, even before the pandemic, 60,000 families were lining up at the food bank to get food. So we must do our work. We must wrap our arms around our families in transformative ways that address the long-standing root causes of their distress. Strategies that fail to do so, that do not build our families' resilience, will leave us right where we started. The pandemic has reminded us that we need to invest directly in families, specifically our most vulnerable families. Back to normal is unacceptable. Our pre-pandemic normal was leaving too many families behind. I was happy to hear you bring up Prop B. That was something that the mayor's office championed because we saw the need for a transformative solution that reached beyond the crisis that our families are now. Addressing the low wages that they were earning before, the dependency on jobs that were not able to allow them to support their families and themselves, has led to the escalation in the need of services during this time. And so Prop B, which I don't mean to correct you in person or in public, was a $154 million investment in our families to give them an opportunity to be able to earn more than a living wage, to have jobs with benefits, to have jobs that allow them to do more than support their families and make their bills, but to allow them to actually enjoy a career in which they're able to flourish. And we know the impact on the mental health and psychological well-being when our families are proud of the work that they do and are able to sustain their families as well. So we're excited about what that new beginning is going to look like, in addition to the other investments that we've made as a city to make sure that we're addressing the issues that I've just covered today. Thank you.
Thanks for the invitation to be part of this conversation. Boy, as you hear the statistics, it's devastating. We know it's bad, but we don't always have all of those numbers and all of those details to realize how deep the pain is and how tragic this crisis is. Way back at the beginning of the COVID-19 season, I sent a note to my kids. I have 3 adult children. They're living all over the country. And in the note, I was encouraging them during this time, at times that are hard, in times that are dark and confusing, and times where we don't necessarily have answers to lots of the questions we feel like we need. My encouragement was to stand up and to be courageous. And to be sure that they were doing more than was required of them. And there were 2 reasons that I said that I wanted them to do that. Number one, because the people around them will notice, and it'll make a difference in their view of them in the days ahead and in the seasons that come after this. But the second reason that I wanted them to do that is because when we go through difficult times, when we stand up and we're courageous and we do more than is required of us, it changes our view of ourselves. It leads us to realize that we have gifts and capacity beyond what we realize day in and day out. I think it's time for the church to stand up and to be courageous and to do more than is required of us. It's for the sake of our world, not just our community, our world, but especially where we live and where we worship and where we thrive, many of us. We have a chance to give hope, to bring hope to our community, to let people see. And when the church does that, people notice. But the second reason, just like I shared with my kids, is because I think the church in many respects has fallen asleep. I don't think we realize the capacity that we have. I don't think we realize the power that we have. You know, there are two things that strike me as being keys to that. If the church is going to stand up, if it's going to be courageous, if it's going to do more than is required, that means, number one, that we've got to love courageously. I loved when you talked about Jesus saying we're going to have trouble, but he's overcome the world. Well, the other thing that Jesus told us is that his followers will be marked in this world, and they're going to be marked by love, that we love the people around us. And so we need to love courageously. But the other thing that I think is even more difficult than loving courageously is that the church needs to collaborate. And I don't just mean within our individual congregations. My goodness, if you've been in a church, you know that that's tough all of its own. But I mean the churches of this community need to collaborate. We need to work together to accomplish more than we could ever accomplish on our own. You know, collaboration is hard, and it doesn't necessarily come naturally. And Mitch, I appreciated when you talked about humility, because collaboration requires tremendous humility. We all want to do it our own way, right? And we all have thin skins when it comes to somebody thinking they have a better idea. But we've got to rise up and be courageous, and we've got to collaborate. You know, when Jesus was praying just before his arrest and he went to the cross, he prayed for the church, and you may remember what he prayed for. He prayed for unity. That the people who follow him, by following the teachings of his disciples, that they would be unified. That's what collaboration is about. And I just can't begin to imagine what happens if the church, the Big C Church of San Antonio, begins to collaborate and love courageously. We can make a difference. We can reverse some of these terrible trends and unbelievable statistics.
Thank you for sharing your heart. And I would just add that I believe that God has prepared the church. He's made us for this moment. That in the same way he sent Joseph to Egypt to prepare the way to provide during the famine, that we have veritable Joseph storehouses in our church. And the deepest reservoir that we have is the gospel, deep love. We're going to move to a time of Q&A. Jenny is going to take the questions from here. We're going to start with a question from online. So if you would like to ask a question here, please make sure you have her attention. Panelists, I can't thank you enough for being here. And please remember that this is the beginning of a conversation, a beginning of collaboration. No one can fully answer every question. We want to hear from everybody. But our first question that came in, Bill, is for you, and I'm going to ask someone else to follow up as you feel led. As pastor of the church, it's essential that we have our people find their highest and best roles in redeeming this crisis and really advocating for families. How have you, as a senior pastor, found your highest and unique best role in empowering your congregation to find their highest and best role for marriages and families?
I'm chuckling, Mitch, because as I hear all of this information, I don't think I've found my highest and best role. There's a lot more that needs to be done by me and in my congregation, and I think in all of our congregations. But there are four kind of strategic areas that where I believe we as a congregation at Concordia need to invest, and I think others need to consider. Number one is in strengthening marriages. Families can't be strong if marriages aren't strong. The second thing is really empowering parents to do the job that God has given them. We've discovered during this time that some parents are amazing and other parents struggle with the role. My goodness, online education, the spectrum is enormous between parents who are able to facilitate that very difficult process and parents who really don't know what to do and sort of are absent from the whole strategy. The third thing is our schools, and we talked about schools, and there were great information about our schools. But coming around our schools, imagine if our congregations adopt schools and pray for schools and lend support to the schools right in our own neighborhoods, the power of that. And the last thing is, again, hearing from these agencies, we need to partner with these agencies, but we need to partner with hundreds, if not thousands, of other agencies in our community. That collaboration doesn't just end with the church working together. It's with the church working in the community with other agencies and nonprofits and organizations to make a difference.
Thank you so much, Bill. I will say that one of our participants here in the room is the head of School Connect, and we have a remarkable corridor for embracing schools and campuses. And there we'll find when we step out in faith towards collaboration that God's gone before us, and He has provided a tremendous network through the church. Anybody else want to respond on, before Jenny leads with a question on how to help people find their highest and best roles in response to this crisis? No one? All right, Jenny, you want to get one of our questions from here? Any questions? Right there in the front.
Hi. Sorry. Really quick. So, underlining conditions, right? That's what we hear with COVID. And knowing that being prepared to have health and wealth to fight things is really important. Is there any suggestions or resources for families that could help us be healthy going into these strenuous moments that you guys are aware of, or something that we could point our families to, just to help prepare them and get them ready, and not get to a place where it's just the end of the world, And so, do you guys have any suggestions that we could, because I work at a church, and I would love to be able to point families not at the deepest moment, but try to get them healthy before it gets really, really bad and severe. Do you guys have any suggestions?
I guarantee that this panel's got suggestions for tools. Please don't be, we're bringing our A game here, so Michelle.
And I can start on a very broad level. My background is in public health, and so upstream solutions are always something that have always been identified as one of the best and key investments that you can make. And some of what we're thinking about at the mayor's office is how can we think about our investments now that are transformative, that are really address root causes, so that when we can't deny that we're likely going to face continuous adversity, whether that's a pandemic, whether that's a natural crisis, whether that's something happening even just within families. And so how do we equip families to be resilient from a health perspective, from a financial perspective, from a social perspective, from a mental health perspective? What are all the levers that we can be investing in to make sure that when families face adversities, they have the resources, internal and physical and external, that allow them to thrive through that? So from the city's perspective, you'll see that many of our investments, whether that's our economic development department or our metro health department, or many other departments, are really focused on thinking about that type of investment in our communities. A lot of the underlying conditions that we hear for those who are disproportionately impacted, that end up dying because they've contracted coronavirus, are tied to chronic illness and diseases that are preventable if we address them early enough, like diabetes or asthma and heart issues. And so our Metro Health Department is really pushing on preventative measures and preventative programs in our community that address community health issues. So that's one way, and I can, if we can get your information, I can make sure I point you in the right direction so that you're aware of what some of those resources are. From a financial perspective, and I'm sure other folks can probably jump in at the other type of services that help families thrive and become resilient. There's a lot of organizations in our community who think a lot about helping families, even families on the margins, build their assets and to be able to get better access to jobs that allow them to have a nest egg or to be able to develop a safety net so that they are able to have emergency dollars when they are in crisis. That's a lot of hard work. We have a lot of work and a lot of catching up to do in our community. But there are organizations that are working specifically with individuals and families to have that financial conversation and to help them figure out how to get in a place. And we're excited about linking those type of efforts to our workforce efforts. So as families begin to earn more, that they're able to begin thinking about their future in a different way now that they may have some of the resources that they're able to be able to do that. But there's so many underlying isms that drive what makes our communities vulnerable. I'm sure there are other folks here that can tie to them. I'm going to pass this mic down to Doug.
He can use this mic.
Okay.
And I just want to say, isn't it humbling that the mayor's office is represented here and in this with us? What an amazing gift in our city. So thank you. And Doug Beach will share, and then I think Jennifer Smith.
Thank you. You know, talking specifically about how families can prepare themselves, and especially in the context of faith communities. This year, through the Pathways to Hope conference that we hold in August, this was the 5th year, we had over 2,600 people tune in virtually, and one of the things we talked about was how do we begin a program in San Antonio that's become very successful in St. Louis. It's called Bridges to Care, and it's based on clustering of churches coming together, educating themselves about mental health, equipping people in those congregations to be able to provide support. So we've kicked that off. The City of San Antonio, the Faith-Based Initiative, Ann Helmke's office she's been a great partner. And, but it's also brought over 20 different groups around all over our community, from University Health System to the UT Health Science Center, Methodist Healthcare Ministries, Center for Healthcare Services, on and on. We've all come together to say, how do we launch this and support this in San Antonio to equip individuals in a congregation to be supportive, welcoming, inclusive, and engaged in mental health support. The real tragedy behind mental health and those statistics I gave earlier, where we rank number 3 in prevalence of mental illness in Texas nationwide, and last in access to care, that's our calling. I mean, that's what we're supposed to be doing right now, is equipping ourselves to support one another, because we know we have completely blown out all the resources. So you'll, if you have an interest in Bridges to Care and in your church participating, we initially were having 10 churches in 10 city council districts, 100 churches, 2 to 6 people in each church. And we didn't know how long it would take to get to determine what the level of interest is. We were blown away. Where we plan to have 1 or 2 start out, we've got 8 in formation right now. So I think it demonstrates the level of interest in San Antonio in kind of meeting this challenge.
I would echo exactly what Doug said. That's what I was going to say. But the root cause is ACEs Nadine Burt did a great TED talk on this. She's a pediatrician out of California, and she talked a lot about the kids she was seeing in her clinic who had asthma and allergies and ADHD and all these other things that they would normally medicate for. Actually, the root cause was trauma. And so there's no magic bullet for the adults in your life at this point, but as a community, the more healthy we become mentally, the more healthy we'll become physically. They are tied together. You cannot separate the two. And so there's a South Texas Trauma Informed Consortium and the stuff that Doug's doing too, that we're going through congregations in various sectors. A lot of people are involved in that here too, to get all sectors of San Antonio trauma informed. Because the more as a community we become more educated on trauma, the better all the other factors will become also. But it's going to take time.
Okay, we have a couple of questions online, and actually some people who are watching that are texting me personally trying to jump line, and we're just going to have none of that. Okay, none of that. The heart of people who are watching are asking questions about when will the crises that we are discussing become as important as wearing a mask and protecting ourselves in public. There's a question here about how do we intervene and stop these crises before they're happening? Michelle, you mentioned the upstream realities. There's a question here about the need for the church and our faith community to begin in prayer, possibly 40 days of prayer and fasting. And before those first two questions are thrown out to you all, I do want to just make a mention on prayer. We have had Pray SA now since August, and you might remember the first Pray SA that was over at the Freeman Coliseum. That continues to happen on Sundays over at San Pedro Park, and it has been a phenomenal collaboration of people who are praying. And if you want more information on that, to join the prayers, please talk to us afterwards, or email, or just text me personally, which some of you all are doing. But would either panelist, any of you all, like to mention, comment on? Well, not the toolkit when we did, but how can we get upstream and begin to prevent some of these things so that the casualties don't continue to cascade?
So Stitch Ministries family counseling is that upstream, where what we would like is for families to come meet with mental health professionals before they get to the point where they have to give up their children. We don't want them to be in that place. And we offer family counseling on a donation basis, because we know that's just the way we've always done things, but we know now more than ever that people really are in that place where they have to choose between feeding their children and providing care for them. And so the other thing that Stitch Ministries has done is partner with School Connect and Raising Highly Capable Kids. Margaret Judson and I teach classes to empower facilitators to teach a curriculum that is evidence-based, that allows parents to help their children develop assets that will help them become caring and profitable adults, right? And so in counseling, what I say to parents is that if we're not affecting the head of the system, then what we're doing with the children in our office isn't helping. And so children function as a part of the system, and we have to affect the head of the system. So if we can do that by putting skills in the hands of parents so that they can help their children develop those skills, then we have provided an opportunity for children to face the challenges they're going to encounter when they leave home one day. So Raising Highly Capable Kids does that. Our School Connect program with Margaret connects businesses and schools and churches. And so we are helping them build relationships with schools so that when the school has a need, they know exactly where to go to get the need that needs to be met. Because we have organizations and businesses in the city that have the capacity and that have the financial means to be able to provide that if the school doesn't. So School Connect, family counseling, Raising Highly Capable Kids, those are all ways to engage in a way that is going to build resiliency with families and prepare them before the crisis ever comes.
Anyone else going upstream? Michelle, Officer Green, why don't y'all just go in order? We'll go Officer Green, then Michelle.
And excuse me, thinking about counseling, there's the stigmatism that we have to battle as well on people looking at counseling as weakness. I will go ahead and say, maybe it's for someone that's watching right now that's thinking, myself, Officer Green, I'm going through counseling right now because this is heavy stuff. I have a good support system through my church and through my home, through my family. But it's good to sit down with a professional and really dig deep into your soul and talk about some hard stuff in a private and safe environment. So trying to find ways, I haven't figured out the answer yet, but maybe it is somebody in a position like I am saying, I'm seeking counseling, I'm seeking help, I need help, I'm not okay. And that's okay, but it's not okay to stay that way. And so us together collaborating, moving forward and encouraging these families, we know you're broken. It's okay to talk about it. There is a safe space. We want to help you. We don't want you to walk through this alone. And again, together we're stronger. So just that encouragement that trying to get past that stigma of counseling being a weakness.
Thank you so much. As you pass the microphone to Michelle, or she has one, I just want to note both of the upstream responses were in different directions. One was the family system, the head of the family, working collaboratively with schools on behalf of children, really trying to intervene before the downstream casualties go too far. The other was individually, and that's really the benefit from the church. To go as far upstream as possible is to begin to allow the gospel to transform us as individuals and allow the love of Christ to really work in our hearts. We're free to be broken. In fact, we might find there's a deeper beauty in our own lives individually when we're honest with that and we allow the love of Christ to heal that. So thank you for leading the way in that, Doug. And then, or Officer Green, excuse me. And Michelle, you wanted to respond.
Yes, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, I'm reading a book right now, which I highly recommend. It's called Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents by Isabel Wilkerson, who also wrote a fantastic historical book that tracked the families who moved during the Great Migration from the South up to the North and particularly the Midwest. And she uses this wonderful metaphor in her book where she talks about the fault lines that cause earthquakes and how researchers have shown that we are constantly underneath. And we didn't have the technology to sense this before, but now we do, that the earth is constantly shifting underneath us. And over time, that could build up to something that's disruptive and actually destroys communities, but that the role that racism plays in our community serves that same purpose. And I think this year, starting last year actually, our whole nation has been invited to have a conversation that we have struggled to have, and to have a reckoning that we have struggled to facilitate, and to have a sense of experience a sense of accountability through our works and through our own internal transformation that we continue to struggle. I think there's a role for communities to grapple with the impact that racism as a root cause in this country has on our families through our policies, through our institutions, through our individual interactions every day that impact the well-being and the ability of our families to thrive. And until we are able to distill and to recognize and to accept that that continues and is a part of our story, we will continue to see disproportionate impact across a series of outcomes, whether that's education, mental health, financial well-being, public safety, that particularly targets and impacts African Americans specifically, and Latino populations and Native American populations in this country in very different ways than other folks in this country. And so I really invite all institutions here, but even us as a city and as a government, have to think about how our policies continue to be informed and continue to be driven and continue to build upon long-term, systemic, institutionally established racist policies and structures that keep us from being as successful as we can be. And I wish I could say that we've figured it out, and I wish I could say that it is a silver bullet for all of us to be cured and to figure that out, but it's a journey. But until we all rise up and say that that's something that we're willing to confront and begin to have conversations about, we're always going to miss the mark as hard as we try.
Thank you very much for highlighting that. Bill, if you could pass that to Jeremy. And I would also, before you share, just commend that for all of us to take to heart. And there is no greater place than the church with the power of the gospel, where we can begin with our own personal, corporate, collective repentance for our own contribution and move forward into what you said in a panel you were on a few months ago, to be the beloved community that we are called to be. So thank you for that. Jeremy?
We're talking about getting upstream as it particularly relates to family violence. One of the, I think, most important things that I can try to impart to our new officers coming on the department is the idea that when you are speaking to an abuser, you're not speaking to one abuser, you're speaking to generations of abusers. And often when you're speaking to a victim, you're not speaking to one victim, you're speaking to generations of victims in that one interaction. And so for us to recognize the kind of generational impact that family violence has on our communities, and then to ask ourselves, how do we intercede, and how do we stop that cyclical kind of violence? And I would point to it's all of our responsibilities to have a proper understanding and perspective on family violence and a proper response to it whenever we are encountered with it. And I think that one of the long-standing ideas about family violence was one of the first studies that presented the idea of a cycle of violence, that there would be a period of building tension, a moment of violence, and then a honeymoon phase. And that was long pushed as the understanding of family violence. But what we recognize is that that is not an accurate picture of what family violence is like. And I would encourage you all, if you have your Google open or whatever, to look for the Power and Control Wheel, is what it's called. And that is a much more accurate representation of what our victims are going through. And if you'll take some time to look at that Power and Control Wheel, it illustrates how an abuser will systematically, again, take control of each part of their victim's life, be it financially or with the children, or through intimidation, physical violence. And so for each of us to understand that and see how we can intercede, whether it's through the schools or through the churches, and to find a way to give our victims their power back, I think is the most important thing.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. And I know we're at the hour now, and there's no way that we could talk about all the tools that are available, all the opportunities that this crisis and the countless other crises afford the church to be the ambassadors for Christ that we're called to be. But we know this. We feel very powerless, but we know the one who holds all the power. One who is not surprised by how 2020 has turned out. And we want to conclude our time together in prayer and dependency. I'm going to ask Les Holland of Trinity Baptist Church, if you could please come up here. But we want to do so with also an invitation. You will get follow-up information. If you're here present, I hope that you will speak into the camera to the church on your way out. It's down in the garden. Please take a minute to do that. It won't even take you a minute. We need your voice. But to everybody that's participating, whether you're watching this now or you're part of the 100 churches that will watch this before 2021, we're in this together. We are made for this moment. And by God's grace, we can show His love, His design in being restorers and redeemers as we have been restored and redeemed by the love of Christ. So, Pastor Holland, will you please close our time in prayer?
Mitchell, thank you and the coordinating team to Envision, and thanks to each of you. You're the ultimate upstream, Lord. You're the creator of the heavens and the universe. With a smile on your heart, you brought each of us into the world and everyone within San Antonio and the 7 billion across this globe. You have a way for us to win through your love and the resources that you provide. You've given us the opportunity and responsibility right now to be on the front line of leadership in the life of the church, in the life of non-for-profit organizations, in light of the city, in order to be your problem solver and trusting your promises to create a pathway. Where there is scarcity, we pray that we may connect abundance. Where there are roadblocks, we pray that we will break through. Where there are wounds that become all the more apparent in the midst of COVID-19, we pray your healing upon structured racism, for gender equality, for the awareness of food equity, for the call and your commitment in the life of the church, how we are aware of how dependent we are on each other, which is our source of strength and not of weakness. Our dependence upon you, from which you give us the capacity to think and to feel and to do. May we then take this morning's conversation in such a way that we are further empowered to release your winning ways by our recognizing that we are to be part of your answer to prayer. May each one feel the stirring of encouragement in the midst of discouragement, the stirring of hope in the midst of despair. May we be there with our forms of ministries that are currently in place, but because of today's conversation, new ministries that either may form or re-collaboration, a redesign of those ministries in light of this partnership which is here. It is in the family, in the life of the family, whether it be with a dad and mom in the life of the children and extended relatives, or whether it be in other configurations, that you want to bring the heart where everyone knows that they belong. And we, within our hearts, have a passionate commitment for that to be made real. We ache for where we're missing, but we hope on bended knee and hands are out in service in order for that to become real. In the way of your Spirit, O Lord, for all of every tradition and faith, but for our gathered here in the way of Christ Jesus, we thank you. Amen.
Thank you all for coming. Please grab a snack, spend time talking, keep your mask on. Can we thank our panelists? Please, please, please.